What if the first kings on earth never claimed to invent their throne, but only to inherit it? Deep under the broken mounds of southern Mesopotamia, where rivers once cut neat lines through wild floodplains, there are still tablets of clay lying in the dark, little rectangles, baked by accident in ancient fires, covered in tiny wedge marks pressed in 4,000 years ago. Not poems, not prayers, records. And tucked inside those records is a memory that feels older than any empire. Each wedge isn't boasting about conquest. It's not some king flexing about how great he was. Instead, the tone is strangely modest. It talks about succession, about stepping into a role that already existed, about inheriting a world that was already measured, already organized, already governed. Before we go deeper into that, take a second to like this video and subscribe, but only if you're into this kind of thing. The kind of history that doesn't reassure you, but makes the ground under your certainty feel a little less solid. And if you're still here, drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I like imagining this quiet web stretching across the world while these old clay whispers drift through all of us at once. Because this story doesn't start with a myth, it starts with a dig. In 1849, a British diplomat named Austin Henry Layard was out in what's now Iraq, digging into the ruins near ancient Nineveh. He wasn't an archaeologist, in the modern sense, more like an enthusiastic looter with funding, but he knew enough to recognize that the broken buildings he was tearing into had once been grand. In the rubble of collapsed libraries, he found something strange. Tablets, hundreds of them, thousands, most shattered, some whole, all covered in a script no one alive could read at the time, cuneiform. Over the next decades, as scholars slowly cracked that writing system, one particular document emerged from the chaos, a text that should not have existed. It was a list, not a story, not a hymn, not a legend, a bureaucratic chronicle, city names, king names, and the lengths of their reigns. The kind of dry, practical document you'd expect in a royal archive. We call it today the Sumerian King List, and it opens with a line that quietly flips our timeline upside down. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Not. Human beings invented kingship. Not. A man seized power by force. Not. Society decided to organize itself. Kingship descended. The text doesn't describe humans creating power. It describes them receiving it like an office, already fully formed, being handed down from somewhere else. Then it starts listing rulers before the Great Flood, kings of cities that existed before the waters came. And this is where the numbers get weird. You get reigns like 28,800 years for one king, 36,000 years for another, 43,200 years for a third. These aren't symbolic figures tucked into poetry. They're written the same way you'd record grain deliveries or livestock counts. Name, city, duration, next line. For more than a century, scholars have tried to explain these numbers away. Maybe they're symbolic. Maybe every year is actually a month. Maybe they point to astronomical cycles. Maybe the scribes were just exaggerating for effect. But the uncomfortable fact is, the scribes themselves didn't treat them like metaphor. They wrote them down with the same flat tone they used for tax records. No commentary. No, as the tales say, just this king, this city, this length of rule. And then everything stops. Midway through the list, a single sentence cuts history in half. Then the flood swept over. That's it. No dramatic build-up, no moral lesson, no angry God speech. Just a hard line between one age and another. Before the flood, cities and kings with reigns that stretch for tens of thousands of years. After the flood, Kingship descends from heaven again. But this time, something is different. The numbers shrink. Post-flood rulers still have unnaturally long reigns, by our standards hundreds of years at first, but they're nothing like what came before. As the list goes on, the durations drop and drop until you reach kings we can cross-check with archaeology, and their reigns are completely normal, 10, 20, 30 years. Somebody, somewhere, thought that before the flood, the world worked differently. Now, if this were just one weird tablet, we could shrug it off. But archaeology didn't let it stay that simple. When excavations began at the actual cities named in the King List, places like Eridu, Uruk, Shuruppak, archaeologists started finding something physical that matched the break in the text: flood layers. At multiple sites in southern Mesopotamia, digging down through the remains of ancient streets and houses, teams hit a band of clean, sterile silt, a layer of water-laid clay, sometimes a foot thick, sometimes more, that had no pottery, no bones, no debris, just sediment. Above that layer, one kind of civilization. Below that layer, another. At Leonard Woolley found exactly this in the 1,920 seconds. At Shuruppak, the city the flood hero rules in Sumerian tradition, archaeologists uncovered the same story in dirt, an obvious break around 2900 BC, where a huge flood event interrupted life, wiped out buildings, then was followed by rebuilding. So no, the flood wasn't just a convenient metaphor. In Mesopotamia, it happened. It left a scar in the ground. But here's the twist that doesn't fit the neat Sunday school version of the story. The cities after the flood, they weren't primitive restarts. The settlements built on top of those flood deposits weren't people learning from scratch how to farm, how to build, how to count. They came back with complex irrigation networks already in place. They oriented their temples with precise astronomical alignments. Their scribes were writing with a number system based on 60, a structure so elegant and weird that we still use it for time and angles today. And when writing appears in these post-flood levels, it doesn't stumble onto the scene. Cuneiform doesn't start as simple little pictograms that slowly evolve over centuries. It shows up ready to go, hundreds of signs, grammatical structure, capable of recording contracts, laws, myths, star charts, medical recipes. It's as if, after the flood, someone pulled knowledge from a shelf and said, "Okay, let's put it back the way it was." At one temple archive in Nippur, when archaeologists went through the tablets, they noticed a certain phrase carved into some of the dedicatory inscriptions, a line kings liked to use when they restored old sanctuaries. It goes something like, "This is the restoration of what was before." Not, "I have built this for the first time." Not, "I have created something new." It's panned by his being, innai, restoration. That one word assumes a lot. It assumes there was a before. It assumes there was a model worth copying. It assumes the builders didn't see themselves as founders of civilization, but as repairmen. Hold that image in your mind for a second. Imagine it's 3000 BC. You're a young scribe in the city of Uruk. Your day starts before sunrise. You sit cross-legged in a courtyard with a lump of clay in front of you and a reed stylus in your hand. The ziggurat towers over the city in stepped layers, its corners lined up with the movements of the sun and stars. You're learning by copying, not experimenting, not inventing. You press into the clay the same signs your teacher shows you, which are the same signs his teacher showed him, which come from tablets so old no one remembers who wrote them first. Your calendar isn't just spring, summer, fall. It's synchronized with lunar cycles. Your teachers can tell you when an eclipse will happen. They can tell you when Venus will disappear from the morning sky and when it will return. Your city runs on written orders, tallies, legal contracts, and if you ever ask where all this came from, who first decided to measure land like this, or divide hours like this, or build temples in these exact proportions, the answer you get is simple. It was given. Given by whom? The texts name them Anu, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag. In the oldest Sumerian records, these beings aren't described like distant, abstract gods. They're not floating clouds of light. They sound unsettlingly practical. They assign cities. They allocate domains. They sit in council and decree destinies, which, in context, often means things like harvest yields, river levels, and king lists, not your personal horoscope. In those early texts, the language around them doesn't sound like religious worship. It reads more like paperwork. They're administrators. And the story the tablets quietly tell is not human beings rose up and invented civilization out of nothing. It's closer to civilization was an office brought down from somewhere else, managed for a time by non-human rulers, and then handed off. And that's where everything starts to get strange. The trail of this weird inheritance doesn't end in a ruined city. It runs straight into a museum basement. In Istanbul, there's a clay prism locked behind glass. It's not huge, about the size of a wine bottle. 4 long sides you could easily wrap a hand around. It was dug up in 1906 from the ruins of Nippur's temple library by a German archaeologist named Hermann Hilprecht. At first glance, it doesn't look like much. No dramatic artwork, no divine scenes, just column after column of tightly packed cuneiform signs. But this little prism holds one of the most complete versions of the Sumerian King List we've ever found. It was copied around 2100 BC by a scribe who tells us very humbly that he's not the author. He's working from ancient sources. In other words, even he thought he was writing down something already old in his time. So when Hilprecht sat down to translate the opening lines, he expected a dry, royal chronology. He got something else. Before the list starts naming kings, we can cross-check against other records. It gives us 5 cities and 8 rulers who supposedly ruled before the flood: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. For each, it gives a king and an impossibly long reign: 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 43,200 years. And these aren't random. They're all neat multiples of 3,000. 600, a number that shows up again and again in Mesopotamian mathematics and astronomy. Then the prism drops that same hard line we saw before. Then the flood swept over. After that sentence, history restarts. Kingship was lowered from heaven again, but this time it goes to Kish. And from there, the reign lengths begin to slide downward. 1,200 years, 960, 840, 720, shrinking dynasty after dynasty, until eventually we're looking at kings who reign for a few decades, people who leave behind tombs, inscriptions, cities we can excavate, same office, same word, kingship, totally different scale. Scholars have thrown every theory they can at those pre-flood numbers. Maybe they're symbolic. Maybe each year is actually a lunar month. Maybe they're encoding cycles of planets or precession. Maybe they're just propaganda kings, inflating their divine ancestors to superhuman levels. The problem is the tone. The scribe on that prism isn't writing like a storyteller. He's not using poetic language. There's no mighty this or glorious that, no metaphors. It's a spreadsheet in clay. City, king, duration. Next entry. The pre-flood kings are treated in exactly the same voice as the later, historically real ones. and the structure is too clean to dismiss. It's not wild fluctuation, it's a staircase. Pre-flood, absurdly long rains. Immediately after the flood, still huge, but clearly less. Then, over time, the numbers drop in steady steps toward normal human lifespans. It's like someone encoded the idea of a world where beings lived far longer, fading, era by era, into our world. There's another layer here that rarely gets talked about. On some copies of the King List, early scribes mark the pre-flood rulers with a little sign that signals divinity. The same word Lugal king is used for all of them, but in those earliest lines, it often appears alongside a determinative that means God. After the flood, that pairing starts to fade. Eventually, it disappears. The office doesn't change. The title doesn't change. What changes is who sits in that role. Before the flood, God kings, in Olphus. After the flood, kings who are still special, still chosen, but ultimately mortal. This is not a creation myth. There are no scenes of the gods shaping the universe out of chaos, no origin of the world. It doesn't explain how humans appeared. It just tracks who held the authority to rule communities on Earth, and how long they did it. And it remembers very clearly that before human kings, someone else was in charge. Some copies of the King List and parallel texts found alongside it start dropping another word to describe those early rulers, Anunnaki. You've probably heard that term before. It's been abused in a lot of fringe theories and clickbait documentaries, but if we strip all that away and go back to the oldest Sumerian tablets, the picture is strangely sober. In the earliest layers of Sumerian and Akkadian writing, the Anunnaki are not thunder-throwing sky monsters. They don't fly around shooting lightning. They appear in quiet, bureaucratic contexts. They decree destinies, which, when you read the surrounding lines, usually means they set things like grain quotas, city fates, river allocations. They sit in council to decide policy, not to fight cosmic dragons. They assign cities, this one under Enlil's jurisdiction, that one under Enki's. They measure time, establishing calendars, festivals, and ritual cycles. Later on, in much later myths, they get merged into underworld gods, cosmic judges, symbolic forces. But if you strip that later mythology away and focus on the oldest strata, the Anunnaki look a lot like an executive council, not abstract gods, not nice, personal deities, administrators. One of the oldest wisdom texts we have, the Instructions of Shurupak, is basically a Bronze Age dad talk, a father giving his son life advice. Work hard, don't cheat, respect your elders, that kind of thing. Then out of nowhere, there's a line that says, "The Anunnaki have determined your fate. Do not change the water channel." Those two ideas, fate and water channels, being dropped in the same breath, is kind of wild. Fate here isn't "you will meet a mysterious stranger." It's "this is how the irrigation network will work, and you do not get to mess with it." The Anunnaki show up as the final authority over infrastructure. Another hymn, from Nippur, describes Enlil, one of the chief Anunnaki, as the one who sets the measuring rod and the line. Those are surveying tools, instruments you use when laying out cities, fields, and canal systems. So, in the Sumerian worldview, the beings in charge of reality aren't just doing flashy miracles, they're literally urban planners. And then, somewhere around that flood line, they stop being hands-on. The earliest flood story we have from Mesopotamia, sometimes called the Eridu Genesis, paints the scene like this. The Anunnaki are running the show, humans are multiplying, the world is getting noisy, not wicked, not evil, just loud and disruptive. Enlil decides this doesn't work. The council votes for a reset, a flood. But one of them, Enki, objects. He can't stop the decision outright, so he cheats. He whispers the plan to a human, Ziusudra, through a reed wall. Build a boat, seal it with bitumen, bring your family, bring animals, bring what you need to restart. The instructions in the text are weirdly practical. Measurements, waterproofing, logistics, then the flood comes. 7 days, 7 nights, cities drown. The text says the Anunnaki watch and tremble. There's regret. They aren't cheering. They're staring at the thing they unleashed. And when it's over, they do not go back to ruling like before. Instead, there's a kind of settlement, a treaty. Humans survive barely, but from now on, lifespans are shorter. There will be distance between humans and the Anunnaki. Less direct contact, less proximity. The King List reflects that idea mathematically. Reigns collapsing from tens of thousands of years, to thousands, to hundreds, to tens. In other words, the flood isn't just a disaster, it's a transfer of power. After the waters recede, kingship descends from heaven again, but now it lands fully on human shoulders. The Anunnaki retreat into the background as distant judges and symbols. Human kings take over the day-to-day. And the people alive afterward don't see themselves as pioneers. They see themselves as the ones trying desperately to keep a system running that someone else designed. That's why, when archaeologists dig beneath these cities, they keep finding something unsettling, layers of rebuilding that all follow the same blueprint. At Eridu, the city the Sumerians themselves called the First City, excavations revealed 18 layers of temple construction stacked on top of each other like a layer cake. The oldest one, already precise, already aligned, already correct. Each time the temple collapses or is destroyed, the next generation builds on the exact same spot with the same layout, same orientation. They're not experimenting, they're preserving. The same thing happens with the big ziggurats. Nebuchadnezzar II, the Babylonian king, famous for rebuilding the massive tower, later remembered as the Tower of Babel, left bricks with inscriptions that say, essentially, I restored the Etemenanki to its former height. I raised its top to heaven as in ancient days. Not, I designed this. Not, look at my genius. I put it back the way it used to be. And beneath his towering structure, archaeologists did find older foundations, earlier versions of the same building, going down and down and down. It's restoration all the way. Mesopotamian kings, from the earliest cities to the late empires, repeatedly describe their job the same way, not to create something new, but to reconstruct something remembered, which leaves us with a big, uncomfortable question. If they believed they were just inheriting, restoring, and maintaining, then who, in their own minds, built the original world they were copying? Ancient scribes didn't dodge that question. They answered it over and over in the only language they had. They called them the Anunnaki. Now, that name has been dragged through all kinds of modern conspiracy theories. So let's clean the slate and go back to how the Sumerians themselves used it in the oldest tablets we can still read. The word Anunnaki breaks down into pieces, and heaven, or sky, ki, earth. Depending on how you parse the grammar, it means those of heaven and earth, or offspring of An, the sky god. Either way, these aren't vague, faraway spirits. They're beings associated with both realms above and below who show up in very specific roles. And those roles are strangely practical. In some of the oldest Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki are not floating in the clouds. They're sitting in council, dividing up territories, regulating water, setting calendars, deciding who gets what. One text describes them assigning cities. This city to Enlil, that city to Enki, this region under the care of Ninhursag. It reads almost like minutes from a meeting. In the debate between winter and summer, a poem that sounds mythic at first, the Anunnaki don't just argue about the seasons. They decree the agricultural cycle, who gets rain, who gets heat when crops should be planted and harvested. Fate in this world isn't purely mystical. It's administrative policy. In the instructions of Shurupak, that father-to-son advice text, the warning, "Do not change the water channel," doesn't mean "don't annoy the water demon." It means "don't annoy the water demon. The irrigation layout you're using was decided by authorities who existed before you. It works. Don't play engineer." In temple hymns, we see Enlil described as the one who sets the measuring rod and line. That's surveying. Enki is called Lord of the Apsu, governing the underground fresh waters, a divine way of saying someone is in charge of the hydrological system that makes agriculture possible. Utu, the sun god, is associated with justice and trade, basically overseeing contracts and fairness. If you strip away the symbolic language, the Anunnaki start looking less like cartoon gods and more like a hyper-centralized executive board for the early world. So what were they? Three main ideas tend to come up. First theory, deified ancestors. Maybe the Anunnaki were originally just powerful human leaders, founders of cities, brilliant engineers, people who figured out agriculture, irrigation, writing, and governance. Over generations, their memory gets inflated, their lifespans stretch, their deeds turn mythic. Eventually, they get folded into the pantheon as gods. There's precedent for that. Egyptian pharaohs were deified. Roman emperors became gods after death. Chinese emperors claimed to rule by mandate of heaven. It's possible the pre-flood kings with 28,800-year reigns are really dynasties, a whole line of rulers remembered as one name. Their actual cumulative impact gets compressed into a single legendary figure. That's neat and tidy. It explains some things, but it leaves a few details dangling. Deified rulers usually leave tombs, monumental graves, stories of their deaths. The Anunnaki don't. They don't die. They just back away, transform from hands-on rulers and teachers into distant judges who set destinies from afar. And the knowledge attributed to them advanced astronomy, base 6-0 math, architectural templates used for thousands of years, looks less like the legacy of a few brilliant chiefs, and more like the output of a very long, organized tradition. Second theory, a lost elite culture. This one's more uncomfortable. In that view, the Anunnaki are cultural memory of a more advanced group, a pre-flood civilization that either got wiped out or broken up by catastrophe. Maybe they had very refined systems for tracking the sky, managing water, planning cities. When the flood hit, they didn't vanish completely, but they lost their infrastructure. Survivors carried fragments of knowledge inland, into places like Eridu and Uruk. Over time, those survivors, different, perhaps visibly distinct, maybe just culturally alien, become remembered as the ones who came before, the ones who brought kingship down from heaven, the ones who showed people how to write, how to measure, how to plan. That would explain why so much of Sumerian science and architecture appears in the record fully formed, no obvious baby steps. Just, here's a working base 6-0 system. Here's a zodiac divided into 12 houses. Here's a temple plan your descendants will keep copying for 3,000 years. The catch? Archaeology doesn't show a clear, separate material culture labelled Anunnaki. No distinctive pottery. No unique burial style. No obvious, Here's the older, smarter people, and here's the simpler locals. What we do see is something subtler, very early layers that are already suspiciously sophisticated for their supposed date. There's complexity at the bottom of the stack where you'd expect experiments. That's it. No smoking gun, just unease. Third theory, they're symbolic personifications. Maybe we're overthinking this, and the Anunnaki are just the Sumerians' way of turning abstract systems into characters. Need people to remember how irrigation works? Personify it as Enki and the freshwater deep. Need them to respect survey lines and property boundaries. Turn the measuring rod into Enlil's sacred tool. Need them to take planetary cycles seriously? Wrap them in myths about gods crossing the sky. In that reading, the Anunnaki aren't real in a literal sense. They're mental shortcuts, archetypes, embodied systems. Humans do this all the time. We talk about the market like it's a living thing. We personify justice, time, death. The Sumerians could easily have done the same with their fragile irrigation-based world. The stakes were high. If you screwed up the canals, people starved. Putting that responsibility into the hands of all-seeing beings would make everyone behave. The problem with stopping there is the paperwork. If the Anunnaki were only metaphors, why has every bureaucratic text treating them like actual authorities? Why invoke them in water rights disputes? Why copy their decisions in legal contexts? Why put their names into land grants and temple charters? Symbols don't usually get that much formal administrative weight, so we end up in this strange space where the ancient record is clear about how the Sumerians thought. They believed civilization was an inheritance. They believed kingship was lowered from heaven. They believed someone else had set up the system before them. Whether those someone else's were literally non-human beings, legendary ancestors, or personified systems is a question the tablets can't settle, because by the time those tablets were written, the Anunnaki were already gone. All the scribes had was memory. And here's where things stop being just a Mesopotamian oddity and start turning into a global pattern. Because if this was only a Sumerian quirk, we could chalk it up to local mythology, but they're not the only ones who preserved a pre-human or more than human age of rule. The Egyptians did it too. In the Sumerian King List, an ancient papyrus from the time of Ramses II, the scribe calmly lists pharaoh after pharaoh with normal reigns, and then keeps going. Before the first human pharaoh, he writes down a long sequence of gods and followers of Horus, who supposedly ruled Egypt for thousands of years. He uses the same format for them, same structure, same matter-of-fact language. No once upon a time. Just, these were the rulers before us. India? Same pattern. The Puranas talk about the 4 yugas, vast ages, where divine or semi-divine beings govern the world directly. We live in the last one, the Kali Yuga, the age of decline, where the gods have stepped back and humans rule in the shadow of something older. Mesoamerica. Again, the Popol Vuh of the Maya and the Aztec codices describe previous worlds governed by other beings, other orders, other suns. Our age is explicitly the 5th, not the first, not the only. These cultures had no contact with ancient Sumer. Different languages, different geographies, different histories. Yet they all remember some version of the same structure. First, a world governed by beings who are not fully human. Then, catastrophe. Then, human rule in a diminished, inherited order. So now the question we started with shifts. It's not just, who did the Sumerians think built their world? It becomes, why does half the planet remember someone else ruling before us? And what kind of event would be big enough, old enough, and traumatic enough that completely separate civilizations would all carry the echo of it, long after the supposed rulers themselves had vanished. If all these cultures are remembering some kind of before us era, what happened to it? If something once ruled, taught, measured, and governed and then stepped away, what marks the moment it let go? For the people of Mesopotamia, that answer is always the same. The flood. We've already talked about Leonard Woolley in other videos, but here he matters again. In 1929, at the ruins of Ur, his team dug past graves, past houses, past broken walls, and hit a dead zone. A thick, sterile layer of silt, about 3 meters of it in places. No pottery, no ash, no bones, no stray beads. Just clean, water-laid sediment. Above it, a city. Below it, another world. Woolley's workers kept going. When they got through the silt, they found collapsed mud brick walls and pottery in styles that didn't match the layers above. It was like someone had taken an eraser, wiped out one chapter, then continued writing on the same page. He sent a message back to London. "We have found the flood." Newspapers loved it. Biblical deluge proven. Museum directors posed for photos. For a while, the narrative was simple. There was an ancient superflood. It wiped everything clean. And after that, civilization began. But as more sites were excavated, Kish, Shuruppak, Uruk, that story stopped fitting so neatly. At Kish, there was another flood layer, thinner but still obvious. Again, sterile, water-laid silt. Under it, settlement. Over it, settlement. At Shuruppak, the city Sumerian texts name as the last pre-flood kingdom, the home of Ziusudra, the original ark builder. Archaeologists found a similar flood deposit dated to roughly 2900 BC. Below it, an organized town with streets and houses. Above it, reconstruction. At Uruk, the stratigraphy showed not a single clean break, but waves. Multiple interruptions, periods where the city shrank or was abandoned, then reoccupied. In other words, there was a real flood, or more than one. But it didn't mark the beginning of culture. It was a brutal interruption in something that was already mature. And that matches how the Sumerian flood stories talk about it. We're used to the biblical version, where the flood is about moral cleansing. The world is wicked. God wipes it out. A righteous man survives. The Sumerian versions, the Eridu Genesis, the Atrahasis epic, have a different tone. The gods don't complain about sin. They complain about noise. Literally, the noise of humanity, the clamour of cities, the disruption of cosmic order. Picture a world of irrigated fields, busy canals, night fires, drum circles, festivals, herds. Humanity is doing what we do best, multiplying and making a racket. In the story, Enlil, one of the chief Anunnaki, has had enough. He proposes a reset, not out of rage or righteousness, out of administrative frustration, population too high, system under strain, solution, hard reboot. The other Anunnaki agree, with some reluctance. Enki, who seems to operate as the dissenter inside the council, doesn't like the plan. He warns a human Ziusudra in Sumerian, later Atrahasis, later Utnapishtim, later Noah in adapted Hebrew tradition. He doesn't give him a sermon, he gives him technical specs. Build a boat, seal it with bitumen, make it this long, this wide, bring your family, craftsmen, animals, seeds. The flood comes. 7 days, 7 nights. The language in the tablets is surprisingly minimal. The storm raged. The flood swept over. Everything turned to clay. The part that stands out isn't the water, it's the reaction. The gods are terrified. Some cower, some panic. One goddess weeps because humans whose cities she loved are gone. This isn't triumph, it's regret. And when the water recedes, the Anunnaki don't return to rule. They show up, accept sacrifices, give the survivor a blessing, and then outline a new arrangement. From now on, human lifespans will be shorter, population growth will be limited, direct contact between Anunnaki and humans will decrease. In other words, we're not doing that again. It feels less like a divine cleanse and more like a negotiated divorce. The Sumerian King List lines up perfectly with this idea. Before the flood, 8 kings, reigns in the tens of thousands of years, kingship explicitly lowered from heaven. After the flood, kingship lowered from heaven again, but this time into very human hands, and the numbers fall. First, post-flood kings, still impossibly long reigns by our standards, but way smaller than before hundreds of years instead of tens of thousands. Then, as the list moves forward, reign lengths shrink. 960 years, 840, 720, 120, 36, 25. By the time you hit figures, we can cross-check in archaeology. The numbers are ordinary human lifespans. From the Sumerian point of view, something about the world itself has changed. The flood isn't just a big disaster. It's a pivot point. Before it, there's one kind of reality. Long lives, direct rule by beings we'd call gods, knowledge that feels complete. After it, there's another. Short lives, human kings, knowledge that feels second-hand. But here's where it gets really strange. If you zoom out beyond Mesopotamia and forget about the specific names, you keep seeing the same structure worldwide. In India, the Manu flood story has a very similar frame. Manu is warned by a fish, an avatar of Vishnu, to build a boat and preserve seeds and life. The flood comes. When it's over, humanity starts again. The event is tied not just to morality, but to the turning of a cosmic age, a yuga boundary. In Greece, Deucalion and Pyrrha survive a flood sent by Zeus. They don't get a new cosmic law. They get instructions on how to repopulate the earth. It feels like rebuilding after a reset. In Mesoamerica, the Aztec sun's cycle includes an age that ends in water. In some traditions, only a handful survive by hiding in a hollow tree or a cave. Humanity begins again. New sun, new world, but always with a memory that there were worlds before this one. Oni to videos. In the Pacific, Polynesian and Aboriginal Australian traditions include stories of rising seas that swallow ancestral lands, a memory that actually lines up eerily well with post-Ice Age sea level rise along those coasts. Everywhere you look, it's the same bones. There was a world. Water rose. That world ended. A few survived. They rebuilt and carried the story forward. There's no way to prove these are all memories of one single event. More likely, different cultures are remembering different floods, local, regional, catastrophic in their own ways, and mapping them onto a much older template. A template that might trace back, as we talked about in your previous script, to the truly massive sea level rises at the end of the last ice age. But in Mesopotamia, there's something extra layered in. The Sumerians aren't just remembering that the world drowned, they're remembering that something else ended with it. The way the tablets tell it, the flood is when the Anunnaki stepped back. Before that, they're front and center appointing kings, founding cities, decreeing fates, teaching crafts. After that, they move into the background. They become judges, symbols, distant powers, invoked in law and ritual, but no longer hands-on rulers. The King List captures their exit in a few dry lines. Then the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, and kingship had once more been lowered from heaven. Once more, again, second time, Whatever kingship was lowered from heaven meant the first time, it doesn't mean the same thing the second. Officially, it's the same formula, authority from above. Practically, it's humans now, wearing the crown, and the texts never show the Anunnaki taking the throne back. From that moment on, human rulers constantly look backward when they build, when they legislate, when they measure time. I rebuilt it as in ancient days. I restored it according to the old writings. I sought out the former foundation. They're not acting like founders. They're acting like caretakers, desperately trying to keep an old machine running without the original engineers. So, if the flood is the line where something steps away, we can ask a sharper question. What does a civilization look like when it genuinely believes it's living in the ruins of a better, earlier order? Because that belief, real or not, changes everything. You don't innovate the same way. You don't write law the same way. You don't treat the future the same way. You become obsessed with one thing above all else. Don't let what they left you fall apart. And that obsession is written all over the clay. That obsession, don't lose what was given, is written all over the clay. Once you start looking for it, you can't unsee it. Again and again, across centuries, kings don't brag. I created this. They say, I found the old plan and followed it. Let me give you one of my favorite examples. In the 6th century BC, near the end of Mesopotamian history, a Babylonian king named Nabonidus rebuilt a temple in the city of Sippar. When archaeologists uncovered the foundation, they found a dedicatory tablet he'd deliberately buried under the wall. It's short, formulaic, very standard. I, Nabonidus, king of Babylon, devoted to such and such god. You know the drill. But then there's this one line that cuts through all the royal boilerplate. I sought out the ancient foundation and built upon it. I discovered the old writings and followed them exactly that nothing might be lost. If you want Rasand, that's not the voice of someone obsessed with glory. That's someone terrified of dropping something. Nabonidus had access to 3,000 years of history behind him. Old dynasties, older kings, legendary rulers, and his instinct, standing at the end of that whole arc, isn't, I will surpass them. It's, I better not be the one who breaks the chain. And when you rewind the story, you see that same anxiety over and over. Civilization in Mesopotamia doesn't move like a staircase, up, up, up. It moves like a heartbeat. Rise, collapse, recovery, rise, collapse, recovery. After the big flood around 2900 BC, cities like Ur and Shuruppak rebuild on the same sites. A few centuries later, everything splinters into warring city-states. Then Sargon of Akkad shows up, builds the first empire, stretches his rule over most of Mesopotamia. Within about 150 years, his dynasty is gone. Climate records show a massive drought. Settlements empty. Trade networks break. The heart stops for a moment. Then the third dynasty of Ur rises from the rubble around 2100 BC. They restore order, centralize administration, codify law. It looks stable. It doesn't last. Internal pressures and foreign invasions bring it down within a century. Over and over, someone patches the system back together, never by saying, here's my new way, but by saying, I've put it back how it used to be. If you 8K, every time there's a rebuilding, the texts say the same thing, according to the old writings, as in ancient days, as it was before the flood, even when they're in charge of something as powerful as law. Take Ur-Nammu, the king who gave us one of the earliest law codes we know. His prologue doesn't present him as the inventor of justice. He says that after kingship had come down, after the gods gave the city to its patron deity, he established justice in the land according to the true word of Utu, Utu being the sun god, the divine judge. He's not writing laws from scratch. He's realigning the courts to a standard he thinks existed before him, a standard he believes wasn't human in origin at all. And over 2,000 years later, when Hammurabi writes his more famous code, he doesn't say, "I have created justice." He says, "I have established justice so that the strong may not oppress the weak, according to what the gods decree." Always backwards, always remembering. You see the same thing with the scribes. We tend to romanticize them as ancient nerds in linen skirts doing math on clay tablets, and they kind of were. But they were also the guardians of memory, and they knew their memory was incomplete. Sometimes they even say it. There's an old Babylonian tablet, a scribal note from around 1800 BC, that basically reads like an academic meltdown. The scribe writes that the old writings are damaged, that the ancient knowledge grows dim, and then adds, "We copy what we can understand and preserve what we cannot." That's such a human line. Imagine sitting at a clay desk, copying characters so old, even you don't know what they mean, but you still copy them, because you're more afraid of losing the text than of not understanding it. They're not curating their past, they're clinging to it. And that brings us to the big, uncomfortable possibility. What if what we call the beginning of civilization is already somebody's restart? Think about it. The earliest cuneiform tablets we've found, those accounting records from Uruk around 3400 BC, are already using a full system. Hundreds of signs, complex grammar, abstract categories. The earliest temples at Eridu are already aligned with the stars. The earliest law codes already assume ideas like contractual obligation and proportional punishment. The earliest medical texts already distinguish between symptom, diagnosis, and prognosis. Now, on top of that, those same earliest sources are constantly pointing back to things before them, from before the flood, from distant days. According to the old text, wisdom from the house of Enki. So by the time we can read anything, they already feel like they're late to the party. They talk like we do when we say, "We know there were civilizations before us, but we only have ruins and scraps." For them, that vague before is the pre-flood world. For us, it's the time before writing, or before agriculture, or before the last ice age. In both cases, the people doing the preserving know they're in the middle of a story, not the start of it. The Sumerians didn't stand on their ziggurats and declare, "We are the first." Their own texts say the opposite. They talk about olden kings whose names they barely remember, rulers who reigned before the flood, cities that were founded in ancient days. My, those divine measures of civilization that existed before humans practiced them. They call themselves the black-headed people, but they never call themselves the first people. They're inheritors, and they know it. You can feel that weight in the way they build. When a king like Ur-Nammu or Nebuchadnezzar or Gudea starts a big project, he doesn't just plop a temple wherever he wants. He digs down literally. He looks for the older foundation, finds the ancient cornerstones, reads whatever tiny, crumbling tablets are buried there. Then he lines his new structure up with the old footprint as closely as he can. He doesn't say, "My architect has a bold new vision." He says, "I have built it as it was in former times," 141s. Even when he changes something, he frames it as restoration. Same with the ziggurats. They're not practical buildings. There are no apartments in them, no storage, no conference rooms, just massive, stepped piles of brick with a tiny shrine on top. They're called things like House of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth. That's not about kings. That's about alignment. Heaven above, earth below, the ziggurat in between a literal bridge, between the realm the Anunnaki once ruled from and the realm humans now run alone. And when you dig under those platforms, you keep finding earlier versions. One ziggurat built over another, over another, over another. Each new structure carefully respecting the footprint of the last, as if there's an invisible blueprint they're all trying to match. It's the same with the numbers. The sexagesimal system base 60 doesn't show any obvious learning curve in the tablets. It just appears, fully operational, used for everything from field measurements to interest calculations. Scribes write things like, according to the old calculations, or as in the tablets of the ancients. Astronomers label their star catalogues as from the time before, or according to the observations of Anu and Enlil. To them, the most precise math they know is not our cutting-edge system, it's the old way. So put all of that together, a civilization whose architecture repeats older templates, a legal tradition that claims to be restoring, not inventing, a scribal culture that feels like it's copying more than understanding, texts that constantly point to before the flood, distant days, old writings. They're not behaving like pioneers. They're behaving like archivists trapped in the aftermath of somebody else's catastrophe. And that's where the Anunnaki matter, not as sci-fi figures or internet memes, but as the shape of that memory. Whether they were deified ancestors, a lost high culture, symbolic personifications of systems, or something we don't have a category for, the role they play is clear. They are the previous administration, the ones who set things up, the ones whose plans everyone is still trying to follow, the ones whose departure turns human history into a long, anxious attempt to keep the machine running without the original manual. And if you see Mesopotamian history through that lens, not as humans rising from nothing, but as humans maintaining someone else's inheritance, you start to see a very different pattern. It's not a story of inventors, it's a story of caretakers, which leads to the question their clay keeps whispering, and that we have to turn around on ourselves. If they lived as heirs, terrified of losing what the flood didn't erase, what are we in danger of losing? In a world where our own floods aren't made of silt, but of data, noise, and time. If you want to keep going, in the next part, we'll look at how other ancient cultures, Egypt, India, Mesoamerica, tell almost the same story of non-human rule disaster, human stewardship, and how weird it is that so many of them treated that as history, not myth. So let's zoom out, because if this whole "we're the heirs, not the founders" thing was just a weird Sumerian quirk, we could shrug it off as local mythology, but it isn't. Once you start listening for it, you hear the same pattern in places that had no contact with Mesopotamia at all, cultures separated by oceans, by millennia, by language and worldview, yet they're all telling some version of the same story. There were rulers before us. They weren't quite like us. Something happened. Now we're running a system we didn't build. Different names, same structure. Let's start with Egypt, because they kept receipts. In a museum in Turin, there's a papyrus that Egyptologists call the Sumerian King List. It's basically the Egyptian version of a master timeline. Pharaohs, dynasties, reign lengths, all lined up in order. At first glance, it looks exactly like you'd expect. You see familiar names: Djoser, Sneferu, Khufu, Ramesses, dates that match monuments. A nice clean sequence stretching back to around 3100 BC. But the scribe doesn't stop there. Before Nama, before the first pharaoh, we recognize he keeps going. He lists an earlier era, the reign of the gods: Ptah, Ra, Shu, Geb, Osiris, Set, Horus, each ruling Egypt for hundreds or thousands of years. Then, after them, another group, the Shemsu-Hor, the followers of Horus, semi-divine rulers who bridge the gap between those god-kings and the first human pharaoh. Only then does the list transition to dynasties you'll see in textbooks. The wild part? The papyrus doesn't switch tone, when it crosses that boundary. It doesn't say, okay, now myth time, and then later, now we're back to real history. The whole thing is written in the same dry, administrative style. Reign lengths, names, order of succession, no commentary, no winking. To the scribe, the age of gods and the age of men are both just history, and the Egyptians acted like it. Temple walls describe the pharaoh as restoring the order established in the time of Ra. Rituals claim to reenact ceremonies performed in the first time Zep Tepi, the primordial era when the gods themselves ruled on earth. The kingdom is not something Egypt thinks it invented. It's something they think they inherited, then watch slowly slip away from the original standard. Jump east. In India, the same pattern shows up, just wrapped in much larger scales. Hindu cosmology divides time into yugas, enormous world ages. The first one, Satya Yuga, lasts 1,728,000 years. In that age, Dharma cosmic order is perfect. The gods are present. The world is governed directly by devas, celestial beings. Humans live long lives, possess clarity, and don't really run things. They participate in an order that pre-exists them. Then the ages decline. Treta Yuga, divine presence fades a little. Dvapara Yuga, it weakens more. And finally, Kali Yuga, the age we're in now, where the gods have stepped back, lifespans have shrunk, confusion reigns, and humans are flying the plane more or less on their own. Sound familiar? Divine administration. Catastrophic transitions between ages. Human self-rule as a kind of downgrade, not an upgrade. The texts don't treat this like pure metaphor. They attach very specific lengths of time to each yuga. They tie the turning of ages to astronomical cycles, planetary alignments, precession of the equinoxes, the same kind of deep sky awareness we see baked into Mesopotamian math and calendars. And again, the language of inheritance shows up. Knowledge of medicine, architecture, sacred sound, ritual isn't described as human trial and error. It's presented as vidya, that which is known, handed down by rishis and gods in earlier ages, preserved in the Vedas, recited to keep a connection with a world more ordered than this one. The core idea is the same. We're living in the late season of a long year. We didn't design the year. Our job is to remember how it's supposed to go. Now, jump across the ocean. In Mesoamerica, the Maya and Aztec don't talk about yugas, but they do talk about world ages, suns that rise and fall. The Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the Quechua Maya, describes multiple attempts at making humanity. First mud people, then wooden people, beings that move and speak, but lack something essential. Those worlds collapse. Then a more complete humanity is formed. But here's the important part. In the successful version, knowledge doesn't slowly evolve from ignorance. It arrives. The gods provide maize, the cosmic crop, and teach people how to grow it. They give the calendar. They set the ritual cycles. They define the structure of kingship. Quetzalcoatl among the Aztec, Kukulkan among the Maya, Viracocha among the Inca. Different names for a very similar figure, a bringer of knowledge, a teacher of astronomy, agriculture, and law. Someone who shows up, sets up the system, and then leaves. Later rulers claim legitimacy by connecting themselves back to that original instruction, echoing the way Mesopotamian kings latch onto the MI and the old writings. And Egyptian pharaohs act as caretakers of Ra's order rather than inventors of their own. And just like in Mesopotamia and India, there's a fracture line, a catastrophe. The Aztec tradition speaks of previous suns destroyed by jaguars, wind, fire, and finally, flood. Our current world, the fifth sun, is explicitly temporary. It's framed as a precarious continuation after repeated resets. Again, higher age, disaster, human-run age in the ruins. Even far out in the Pacific, on islands that had zero contact with Egypt or Sumer or Mesoamerica, you get echoes of the same pattern. In Hawaii, traditions talk about the Menehune, a mysterious people said to have built fish ponds, temples, roads, engineered structures with impressive precision before disappearing into the forests and mountains. On New Zealand's North Island, Maori oral history remembers the Patupaiarehe, pale, elusive beings who knew special arts and lived in the highlands before humans fully settled the land. Not gods in the sky, but not just regular people either. An older someone that was here, building and shaping before the current population. These stories aren't just little people in the woods fairy tales. They're attached to real structures, stoneworks and earthworks, whose design is more sophisticated than you might expect for the earliest known settlements in those places. Once again, the pattern. There were builders before us. We live among their leftovers. We remember them as something more than human, because what they did feels beyond what we can now do. You can explain each of these traditions in isolation. You can say, Egypt mythologized their past. Hindu cosmology is symbolic. Maya and Aztec myths are allegories for social change. Pacific tales are just folklore to explain old ruins. And sure, on one level, that's true. Every culture wraps its history in sacred language. Every society turns its founders into legends. But when you step back and look at the pattern across all of them, something strange happens. They're all saying, there was an earlier order, more complete, more connected to heaven, however they define that. Non-human or semi-divine beings ran things, gods, deva, god-kings, culture bringers. A break happened, a flood, a catastrophe, a turning of the age. We took over as stewards, not as creators. What we have now is partial, a fragment, a recovery, an echo. And crucially, the ancients themselves didn't file that under myth on a separate shelf. They stitched it straight into their timelines, their king lists, their calendars, their legal systems. To them, we inherited this from someone before wasn't a metaphor. It was the framework. So here's where it gets interesting for us. We live in a culture that tells the opposite story. We like origin myths, where intelligence climbs out of nothing. Hunter-gatherers discover agriculture. Villages invent writing. Trial and error eventually gives us science, math, medicine, law. Our timeline moves from simple to complex, from ignorance to understanding. Their timelines move from complete to broken, from clarity to fading memory. We see ourselves as the first true adults in the room. They saw themselves as the kids who found the manual after the engineers were gone and could only read half of it. So when Sumerians say kingship descended from heaven, when Egyptians list god kings as part of their actual chronology, when Indian texts talk about Deva-administered golden ages, when Mesoamerican stories describe knowledge bringers who left, they might not be giving us a literal census of otherworldly beings, but they are telling us how they saw their place in time, not at the bottom of a rising slope, but on a plateau after a cliff, trying not to fall any farther. And whether you take their stories as literal, symbolic, or somewhere in between, that mindset matters. Because a civilization that thinks it invented everything behaves very differently from one that thinks it's barely holding together a legacy. In the next part, we'll go back to Mesopotamia and look at what that air mindset actually did to their day-to-day world, how they built, how they learned, how they handled law, medicine, even time itself, when they believed the best stuff already belonged to the past. So let's go back to Mesopotamia now, not to the cosmic timelines and impossible reign lengths, but to the ground level, to the bricks, to the people who actually had to live inside this worldview of inheritance. Because believing we're the heirs, not the founders, doesn't just change how you tell stories. It changes how you build a house, how you pass an exam, how you think about laws, medicine, even the flow of time. It turns everyday life into maintenance. Imagine you're a king in ancient Sumer. You've just taken the throne. Maybe your father died. Maybe you seized power. Maybe the city elders pulled you out of nowhere because everyone else already failed. You stand on top of your city's main temple platform, looking out over mud brick walls, canals, fields, and the flat horizon. It would be so easy to think, this is mine, I built this, this is my age. But your scribes are already whispering the first thing you have to do. Restore the temple. It's now. Not build a new one. Not redesign the city. Restore what's there. That's the pattern we see again and again in foundation inscriptions. I rebuilt the house of Enlil as it was in distant days. I restored the temple of Nana according to the old writings. I sought out the ancient foundation and set my bricks upon it. Over and over, different kings, different centuries, same language. And when archaeologists dig underneath those statements, they find that it's not just propaganda. Under Nebuchadnezzar's Tower of Babel in Babylon, older foundations, same orientation, same basic footprint, stacked layer by layer through time. Under Ur-Nammu's ziggurat at Ur, earlier platforms, earlier temple bases, same alignment to the cardinal directions, same sacred proportions. Under the earliest visible temple at Eridu, 15, 16, 17 older structures, each one an enlarged copy of the first, going all the way back to before 5000 BC. Every time a king says, I rebuilt as it was, the dirt quietly says, yeah, he actually did. This isn't innovation culture, it's restoration culture. Architecture is not, what do we want? It's, what did they do, and can we still match it? Now drop down another level to the scribes. You're a teenage trainee in a scribal school in Nippur. You spend your days hunched over clay, stylus in hand, copying the same lines until your wrist aches. You don't get to invent texts. You recite them. Your homework isn't write a story. It's copy this legal formula without error, then copy it again in Sumerian, then again in Akkadian. Okay. On some tablets, you can literally see the exercise layout, the master text in one column, the student's clumsy version beside it, wedges wobbly, signs uneven. But look at what they're copying, not just fresh compositions. A lot of it is already labelled according to the old text, or from the writings of before the flood. So from the very first day you pick up a stylus, you're told, the highest wisdom is older than you. Your job is not to improve it. Your job is to not wreck it. That shows up in the margins too. Scribes add little notes like, copied from an ancient tablet. Let no one change a single sign. Old writing. The meaning is obscure, but it must be preserved. Imagine that. You're copying a medical recipe or a star catalogue you don't fully understand, but the culture has drilled into you that changing it would be worse than ignorance. Better to carry forward a puzzle than erase it. That's how astronomy survives. That's how complex math survives. Not because every generation deeply understands it, but because enough people are trained to respect the text more than their ego. It's not the fastest way to progress, but it's a surprisingly effective way to keep things from disappearing completely. Now think about law. We like to think of law codes as dramatic moments of invention. Behold, Hammurabi, giver of laws. But when you read the prologues on those stone stelae, the kings themselves are saying something different. Ur-Nammu, I established justice in the land according to the true word of Utu, Hammurabi. Then Anu and Enlil called me, to cause justice to prevail in the land, to destroy the wicked. according to the laws they ordained. It say, the king is not claiming to invent justice. He's claiming to restore it. The law is treated as something that exists outside of him, given once, long ago, then forgotten, twisted, or neglected, and now brought back as it was. So, even when a king absolutely is innovating, adding new clauses, adjusting penalties, addressing social changes, he wraps it in the language of memory. I am simply putting things back the way the universe says they should be. That's not just theological fluff. It shapes how people argue. If you bring a case to court in Babylon, you don't say, this custom is unfair, let's change it. You say, this judge is violating the true, ancient standard. You reach backward, not inward. Authority flows from the past, not from majority votes or royal charisma. Medicine works the same way. Open a Mesopotamian diagnostic text, and it reads shockingly modern in places. If the patient's skin is yellow and his eyes are white, and the pulse is weak but regular, and he complains of pain in the right side, you get long lists of symptoms, observations, possible outcomes. Some sections are basically case reports, but again, the authority isn't Dr. X found this last year, this I've. It's, these are the procedures established in the time of so-and-so, according to the wisdom of Gula and Ninurta. The gods of healing are credited as the origin. The human physician is a technician maintaining a system, not an inventor building a new one, and that has consequences. You're less likely to throw out old remedies just because you don't know why they work. You're more likely to catalogue, classify, and preserve. It's conservative medicine, slow to change, but also slow to erase. Even time itself is inherited. We measure seconds and minutes and degrees the way we do because somebody in ancient Mesopotamia decided 60 was the magic number. Base 60 math runs underneath the whole system, but the Sumerians never sit there and say, we proudly announce this brand new numerical framework. They say things like, we use the counting of the ancients, or according to the numbers of heaven. Crossed in the Mose, in the Beda, and Crosta, they treat the sexagesimal system as something discovered, not invented, woven into the structure of the cosmos, not made up by clever accountants. So, when later cultures borrow it, Babylonians, Greeks, everyone down the line, they're not just adopting a tool, they're buying into a story. These numbers are older than us. We're not playing with arbitrary units. We're speaking the language of the universe. That's why base 60 has survived in those weird little pockets when almost everything else about Mesopotamia vanished. You still live inside their time. If you zoom out, a picture starts to form. Kings don't brag about originality. They brag about finding old foundations. Scribes don't chase personal fame. They train to be perfect copiers. Laws are restored, not created. Medicine is according to ancient practice. Numbers and calendars are according to heaven. Everywhere you look, the same instinct. Don't lose the thread. Because somewhere behind you is an age when they were here, whether you imagine them as Anunnaki, gods, culture bringers, or just impossibly wise ancestors, and you're terrified of being the generation that drops what little is left. That fear sits between the lines of so many texts. The old writings are damaged. The ancient knowledge grows dim. We copy what we can understand and preserve what we cannot. In 24. Tell me, that doesn't sound familiar. We like to think we're different, hypermodern, rational, unbound by myth. But look at how we treat certain things. Foundational documents, canonical equations, sacred texts, old code bases, legacy systems we're too scared to fully rewrite. We inherit, we patch, we maintain, we just tell ourselves a different story about it. In the next part, we're going to push this even further and ask the uncomfortable version of the question. If the Sumerians were already living in the aftermath of a forgotten world, what does that say about us? So let's bring this uncomfortably close, because it's one thing to talk about Sumerian scribes with clay tablets in dim temple rooms. It's another to realize we're doing kind of the same thing, just with more pixels and less mud. We tell ourselves we're different. We talk about progress, disruption, innovation, like we're sprinting into a future no one has ever seen before. But look at how we actually live. We still behave like heirs. Think about the stories we wrap our own world in. Modern history books talk about the beginning of civilization. Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, China. As if one day a switch flipped and people went from foraging to city planning overnight, and we've been climbing steadily upward ever since. We draw those tidy timelines. Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, Classical, Medieval, Renaissance, Industrial, Digital, a clean staircase. But when you zoom in, really zoom in, it doesn't look like a staircase. It looks like a heart monitor. Spikes, crashes, flatlines, sudden peaks of knowledge followed by centuries of forgetting. We love the story that we discovered math, philosophy, engineering. But even our own milestones are almost always framed as rediscovery. The Renaissance didn't describe itself as inventing brilliance. It called itself a rebirth of classical learning. Medieval scholars didn't say, "We've surpassed the ancients." They wrote commentaries on Aristotle and Galen like they were sacred texts. Early modern astronomers, Copernicus, Kepler, were digging through Babylonian and Greek observations older than Christ to make sense of the sky. Progress, for us, has always worn the mask of remembering what was lost. And when we hit those moments of shock, like when 19th century scholars realized the Babylonians were doing complex math 3,000 years before Pythagoras, it doesn't feel like a new world appearing. It feels like an older world stepping out of the shadows. Look at our own Anunnaki moments. Not ancient sky beings, just names we instinctively treat as more than human. Newton, Einstein, Darwin, Tesla, the founding fathers, the ancient Greeks, the classics. We frame them exactly the way Mesopotamians framed their pre-flood rulers, as people who understood something more fundamental than we do, whose work we quote to legitimize our own decisions. We say, according to the Constitution. We say, as Newton showed. We say, going back to the original Greek. We stand in front of microphones, write laws, publish papers, and we reach backward for authority, just like a Sumerian king invoking the old writings while dedicating a temple. We've just swapped Enlil and Enki for peer-reviewed sources and constitutional precedent. Same structure, different costumes. Now think about how fragile our own knowledge actually is. The Sumerians used clay, maybe not glamorous, but brutally durable. Drop a baked tablet into a fire, bury it under rubble, forget it for 4,000 years, and someone with a toothbrush and a lot of patience can still read it. We, on the other hand, we put our memory on spinning disks, magnetic strips, optical layers, cloud servers that depend on power grids and corporate solvency, and file formats that age faster than a king's reputation. Try opening a file from 1995 on a modern computer. Half the time you need an emulator, a converter, some obscure driver. Now stretch that problem out not 30 years, but 300 or 3,000. Our entire global archive lives on media that, in geological time, might as well be smoke. We think we're the civilization that remembers everything, but we also delete stuff faster than any culture in history. We overwrite, we compress, we format, we migrate to new platforms and abandon the old ones, like ruins. We're not building ziggurats, we're building Snapchat, and yet we still act like what we're doing will be legible forever. Now imagine a future archaeologist, not in 5 years, not in 50. Think in Sumerian time, 2,000, 3,000 years from now. They dig through the rubble of what used to be coastal cities, because remember, our own seas are rising. Maybe Miami's gone. Maybe parts of Bangkok, Shanghai, New York, Lagos, Amsterdam, all turned into layered silt and concrete. They find thick bands of plastic and rebar where topsoil used to be, corroded server racks, motherboards fused into lumps of metal and sand, tablet screens shattered, batteries burst, data layers long since scrambled by heat and time. That's our flood stratum, a layer of artificial sediment marking where our world peaked and broke. Maybe, if they're lucky, they'll find some stone, something analog, a few engraved monuments, a handful of books that got buried the right way. But the vast majority of what we know today, the stuff we think defines us, the code, the data, the videos, the lectures, the memes, that dies when the power does. And then those future scholars will do the same thing Woolley did at Ur. They'll cut a trench. They'll hit the layer with our trash. They'll call it a catastrophe. They'll speculate about what we knew, what we believed, how we governed. They might find our equivalent of the King List, a carved stone, a bronze plaque, a weirdly preserved building with names etched into the foundation, and they'll ask, did these people think they were first, or did they think they were inheriting something older? If they look carefully, they'll see both. Our obsession with the future and our constant, quiet dependency on the past. We're already leaving behind our own restoration inscriptions. Think about how often we say, we're returning to traditional values, we're restoring democracy, we're going back to the original vision of the internet, we're reviving old school craftsmanship. Every one of those phrases is a miniature version of, I rebuilt the temple as it was in ancient days. We feel something slipping, so we dig backward, reaching for some earlier blueprint we trust more than whatever we just invented last Tuesday. Even in tech, our most aggressively forward niche, what do we do when things break? We roll back to a previous version. We restore from backup. We praise legacy systems that have mysteriously survived multiple rewrites because underneath the spaghetti, they just work. That is pure Mesopotamian energy. And then there's the climate. This is where the flood stories really stop being abstract. When the Sumerians talked about waters sweeping over, when they wrote that kingship was withdrawn and lifespans shrank, they were wrapping a psychological response around environmental trauma. The river changed. The rain patterns shifted. A flood hit harder than usual. Entire communities disappeared. People moved inland and tried to rebuild. Now we're watching ice sheets melt, shorelines creep inland, storms amplify. We have satellites. We have CO2 graphs. We have IPCC reports instead of clay tablets. But we're telling the same kinds of stories. The seas are rising. We're entering a new age. This is a turning point. If you peel away the technical vocabulary, it's the same emotional script. Something about the world's settings is changing. We're not in control. The future is going to look very different from the past. And we're already thinking like inherited world people without realizing it. Because when we talk about responsibility, about what we owe future generations, we aren't imagining ourselves as founders of a brand new timeline. We're imagining ourselves as a link in a chain, exactly the way those scribes in Nippur did. So here's the unsettling conclusion that's starting to form. The Sumerians might not have been wrong about the shape of history, not the details, not the Anunnaki, not the exact reign lengths, but the pattern that knowledge appears, peaks, and partially disappears. Civilizations rebuild along old foundations, using fragments they barely understand. Authority is always reaching backward for legitimacy. Big environmental changes like floods and climate shifts slice history into before and after. They lived in the shadow of a flood and said, "We're inheritors." We live in the shadow of our own rising seas and still say, "We're pioneers." But underneath the branding, we're just another link, another layer someone else might one day dig through. And that leads to the hardest question of all. If the Sumerians were terrified of losing what little survived from the world before them, and they still lost most of it, what are we willing to lose? And what, if anything, are we preserving on purpose for the people who come after our flood layer is laid down? In the next part, we'll follow that question all the way down, from clay tablets to hard drives, from king lists to constitutions, from kingship descended from heaven to authority comes from the people, and ask what we're really passing forward and what we're quietly letting sink. Think about those two phrases for a second. Kingship descended from heaven. Authority comes from the people. On the surface, they couldn't be more different. One is cosmic, vertical, top-down. The other is modern, horizontal, bottom-up. But structurally, they're doing the same job. They're origin stories for power. They're answers to the question every civilization has to solve before it can really function. Why should anyone listen to you? For the Sumerians, the answer was simple and terrifying. Because this is how it's always been. Because this office existed before you. Because those who held it first were closer to the source than you'll ever be. Kingship didn't start with Alulim or Gilgamesh. It started in heaven. They were just borrowing it for a while. We tell a different story. We say, authority comes from consent, from votes, from social contracts, from we the people, end quote. But watch how we actually treat our founding documents. We write constitutions, and then we treat them like tablets. We quote them in courts. We argue over original intent. We build entire legal systems around the exact phrasing chosen by a tiny group of people in a very specific moment centuries ago. We don't say, "This is what makes sense right now." We say, "This is what the founders wrote." We elevate a handful of humans into something larger. Not gods, not quite, but not just regular people either. They become a kind of secular Anunnaki, not because they live for 28,800 years, but because their decisions are treated as if they extend across centuries. Their signatures on parchment still control the lives of people who haven't been born yet. That's mythic behavior, hiding in plain sight. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. The Sumerians admitted they were inheritors. They carved it right into the clay. Kingship descended from heaven. This temple is restored as it was in ancient days. These laws are according to the old writings. They never said, "We figured this out from scratch." We do. We tell ourselves that democracy, human rights, science, technology, our entire niche of modernity is something we invented through genius and struggle and enlightenment. But in practice, we're always reaching backward to Roman law, to Greek philosophy, to biblical morality, to the founders and the classics and the canon. We might have swapped clay for paper and servers, but we still legitimize the present by pointing at the past. Just like kings in Ur, just like priests in Eridu, different costumes, same pattern. Now fold in the memory problem. Mesopotamian scribes had one advantage we don't. They picked a medium that doesn't care who conquers who, fire or clay tablet, and unless someone deliberately smashes it, it'll outlive empires. It'll sit in the dirt, ignoring language shifts, regime changes, religious reforms. It'll just wait. When we want something to last, what do we use? Paper? Plastic? Cloud storage? None of those are built for 1,000-year timelines. A scroll burns. A book molds. A drive corrupts. A password dies with its owner. Even our permanent records sit on machines that depend on endless chains of assumptions. That there will be electricity. That someone will maintain the hardware. That future operating systems can read these odd old formats. That anyone will care enough to keep migrating data forward. Sumerians baked clay once and walked away. We have to constantly keep our memory alive or it vanishes. And we're not great at that. Websites go offline. Companies fold. Platforms die, taking petabytes of human memory with them. One corporate decision, one bankruptcy, one war, and entire archives evaporate. It doesn't look like a bonfire. It looks like an error message. Imagine this. Future archaeologists are standing in the ruins of what used to be a data center. The racks have collapsed. The cables are dust. The storage units are warped and fused. All the knowledge we thought we were backing up into the cloud, the research papers, the personal journals, the maps, the blueprints exists now as layers of scrambled bits trapped inside dead hardware. They open a nearby corner of the site and find a stone monument, a list of names, a constitution engraved in granite on a public square, a memorial with a date and a sentence about freedom or unity or never again. Which one survives? Not the terabytes, the stone. Just like how we know more about Sumerian law than we do about half the conversations they had in those cities. The mundane stuff, the daily gossip, the little frustrations, they're gone. What survived is what someone bothered to carve into something hard. We're doing the same thing, whether we realize it or not. Most of our world is noise. The parts we elevate into ritual, etched into public monuments, repeated in ceremonies, quoted in schools, those are our old writings. Those are what will accidentally become sacred. And then there's this irony. The stuff we don't want to last probably will. Plastic, concrete, nuclear waste, CO2 in the atmosphere for tens of thousands of years. Our most forgettable objects are the most immortal. Our most important ideas are often the most fragile. Sumerians accidentally picked a medium clay that was good for both. We picked a medium that's perfect for speed and terrible for endurance. We can beam a video to the other side of the world in seconds, but we can't guarantee that video will be watchable in 100 years without constant care. We're optimized for virality, not longevity. So if we are living in one of those before the flood eras, if rising seas and climate shocks turn parts of our world into the next flood stratum, what will actually make it through? Probably not the lecture where someone carefully explains our political theories. Probably not your favorite long-form YouTube video. Probably not most of what universities are producing every year. What might survive? Inscriptions on stone, metal plaques, some printed books buried in the right conditions, fragments of architecture, stories that keep getting retold, even when the details warp, which is exactly what survived from Sumer. Not their daily schedules, not their full science, just the bones of their world view. Kingship descended from heaven. There was a flood. We rebuilt according to the old writings. Now, flip the camera around. If some future culture digs us up and tries to make sense of our ruins, how will they perceive our origin story for authority? They'll see constitutions treated almost like sacred objects, founding documents displayed in climate-controlled glass, presidents and revolutionaries whose names are carved into statues thousands of times. They'll read phrases like, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, under God, end quote, in accordance with the will of the people. They may not understand our theology, they may not understand our politics, but they'll recognize the pattern. They'll say, These people believed their authority flowed from something bigger than any single ruler. They anchored their laws in a moment they considered foundational. They treated their past as more legitimate than their present. And they'd be right. We do. We rarely say, "This is right because we choose it today." It was Anta's. We say, "This is right because it matches what was written before." Because that's what makes systems feel stable. Because that's the only way to tame the chaos of "we could do anything." We don't live in a world of pure invention. We live in a world of curated inheritance. So here's the question that ties all of this back to those first clay tablets. If Sumerian scribes spent their lives desperately copying fragments from a world they already knew was slipping away, if Egyptian priests listed gods and semi-divine kings the same way we list presidents, if so many cultures preserved the memory of being governed by something other than themselves, what are we actually passing on? Is it our science, our tech, our niche of hyper-optimization, or is it going to be something much simpler, a faint memory that once there was a world ordered by rules we didn't make, and something happened, a flood, a climate shift, a collapse, and then people tried to rebuild by digging through whatever was left? In the next part, we'll zero in on that rebuilding instinct, how civilizations after catastrophe rebuild along old lines, how we're already doing it in real time, and what it would actually look like if we decided to leave behind something more durable than another lost hard drive. Picture this: the flood has come and gone. Not a single apocalyptic wave, not a Hollywood wall of water, but decades of storms, surges, failures, and slow retreat. One day, the satellite maps don't match the coastline anymore. A decade later, half the world's major ports are useless. A century later, the old shorefront financial districts are reefs. Somewhere inland, on higher ground, a group of people are staring at ruins that used to be servers, power plants, skyscrapers, and they're asking the same question Sumerian kings once carved into clay beneath their temples, even if they don't use the same words. How do we rebuild this? And what are we rebuilding it from? Because here's the thing, history keeps whispering. Civilizations do not start from nothing. They restart. And when they do, they don't reinvent everything. They salvage. They copy. They try to restore what was before. Look at how that plays out in the ancient world. After the Mesopotamian flood, people didn't wander into the desert and decide, let's try something totally new. They went back to the same spots, the same river bends, the same high ground, the same sacred points in the landscape. At Ur, the post-flood city sits directly on top of the pre-flood one. At Eridu, temple after temple after temple stacks neatly on the same coordinates for 3,000 years. Nobody said, let's design a different kind of temple. They said, where did the old one stand? Align it like that. The emotional logic is simple. When everything has been erased, the safest thing you can do is copy the last version that worked. We're not different. Think about how we already respond to disaster. An earthquake takes down a cathedral. We don't build a mall. We build the cathedral again, as it was, as close as our funds and memory allow. A historic district burns. There are arguments about restoration versus modernization, but the instinct, the political pressure, the symbolism, all push toward rebuilding the old silhouette. Even after wars, cities rebuild their landmarks like stitching a memory back into space. Warsaw's old town reconstructed from paintings. Dresden's Frauenkirche pieced together from its own rubble. Tokyo preserving temple plans through countless fires. We don't like losing anchor points. We don't like being unmoored. So, when the reset comes, whether from water, war, or slow systems failure, our first instinct is going to be the same as every civilization before us. Where were the foundations? What did the old text say? How do we get back to that? The Sumerians had clay tablets and temple plans. What would we have? Think about what you assume will guide a future rebuild. Most people, if you ask them, say things like, we have the internet, someone will have it backed up. There are seed vaults, archives, foundations. We store everything now. We're safe. But almost all of that depends on continuous power, global supply chains, stable politics, specialized maintenance you never even see, one long cascade of disruptions, a cyber attack, a prolonged blackout, a few crucial factories knocked out, a war over resources, and suddenly the world's permanent digital memory is sitting on dead plastic boxes no one can read. In that kind of world, small things become ridiculously important. One printed manual, one shelf of books, one literal stone inscription, one community that still knows how to do something without modern infrastructure. Just like one stash of tablets in a collapsed room was enough for a later king to say, I restored it according to the old writings. We assume our old writings will be PDFs and cloud backups. But if the flood is slow and messy, the survivors might be looking at those libraries the way we look at a ziggurat core. We don't know how they built this. We don't know how they powered this. But we can see the outline of what they were trying to do. Here's where it gets really meta. We are already rebuilding. We just don't call it that. We keep reaching for older models every time we feel the current system slipping. Constitutional courts arguing over what some group of men in powdered wigs intended. Religious revivals claiming to restore original practice. Political movements promising to make X great again, whatever X is. Tech companies selling ideas as back to basics. Return to the roots. Build like it's 1995. That is the same psychological move Sumerian kings made. My reform is legitimate because it matches something older than me. Even the modern obsession with ancient wisdom, ancestral diets, lost teachings, is a kind of cultural muscle memory. In times of uncertainty, look backward. We're already behaving like people who sense that our knowledge is fragile. We feel the edges fraying. We know we rely on systems most of us can't explain. We feel how dependent we are on electricity, networks, and supply chains. We see how fast platforms and formats die, so we cling harder to whatever looks like a foundation. Old stories, old laws, old myths, old identities. It's the same impulse that made Nabonidus dig for ancient building plans 2,500 years ago. He felt things slipping, so he went looking for older blueprints. We scroll past that part when we talk about ancient kings, but that's exactly what he was. A guy doing emergency archaeology to figure out how to reconstruct something he no longer fully understood. So what would it look like if we consciously prepared for that moment instead of stumbling into it? If you strip away the mystique, the Sumerians did 3 extremely practical things right. They wrote important stuff in a durable medium, clay, fired hard, no batteries, no updates. They built in layers, temples, cities, monuments, each generation stacked on the last, instead of wiping it clean. That means later people could literally see the past. They encoded their worldview in stories simple enough to survive distortion. There was a flood. Kingship descended from heaven. We rebuilt according to the old writings. You can live in a village with no books and still pass those ideas on. So if you wanted some future civilization to know what we knew, not the trivia, but the big patterns, how would you do it? You'd probably put key knowledge in formats that don't rely on software. Etch some things into stone or metal. Make sure your most important lessons exist as stories, not just as data. Stories spread even when infrastructure doesn't. You might want them to remember, food doesn't come from stores. Energy doesn't come from walls. You can't keep stripping the system faster than it can heal. This is what happened last time the climate shifted, not as academic reports, but as narratives that can be retold around a fire without losing their teeth, because that's what survived from before the Sumerians. Not the technical details of meltwater pulses and glacial retreats, but a shape. Water rose, the world we knew drowned, we rebuilt, and the next time it happened, they recognized the pattern. Here's the part most people don't like to think about. We might already be the post-flood civilization to someone else. For all we know, we're Sumer. Not the beginning, not the end, just one branch, one attempt at rebuilding after some earlier collapse, whose details are now gone. If that's true, then we're standing in exactly the same spot they were, inheriting systems we didn't design, maintaining technologies we barely understand, telling stories about how it all began, while our own texts quietly point further back. And that leads to the question that actually matters, knowing how fragile our memory is, knowing how cycles of flood and forgetting seem to be baked into the human story. What do you want to make harder to erase? Because something will be. The only choice we really get is what. In the next part, we'll bring this all the way home, zooming in from Sumerian clay to modern coastlines, to our own rising seas, and to what kind of old writings we're accidentally preparing right now for whoever digs through our layer of the earth. So let's do that zoom out. Let's step from the ruins of Ur and Eridu, straight into the ruins that will one day be us. Imagine a future archaeologist, not in a silver spacesuit with a laser scanner, just a person with a trowel, a notebook, and a question. What happened here? They're standing where a coastal city used to be. Our time? Gone. Sea levels rose, storms hit harder, economies broke, borders moved, and over a few hundred years, the old shoreline became a ragged line of eroding ruins and shoals. The city they're digging through might be a flooded district of Miami, a half-submerged port in South Asia, or what's left of a European coastal hub nobody remembers by name anymore. Around them, concrete skeletons wrapped in barnacles, rebar blooming with rust, plastic layered like a synthetic fossil horizon, fragments of glass, chipped screens, twisted wiring. To them, it's the Pleistocene layer, the age of plastic. And buried inside that layer, they start finding objects that don't behave like normal artifacts. Tiny glass rectangles, melted, cracked, sometimes still intact. Circuit boards, microchips, sealed metal bricks that used to be servers or drives. All of it clearly important to us and utterly silent to them. No power, no compatible devices, no way to read the code, even if they guess its information. To them, it's like us staring at the Sumerian King List before we learned cuneiform. You can feel there's meaning there, you just can't unlock it. So they do what we did. They fall back on what can survive. Stone, ceramic, metal, analog. They find foundation plaques from skyscrapers, still faintly legible, war memorials with names etched in granite, coins, medals, engraved seals, cornerstones that say, rebuilt in the year. They start piecing together a story, not from our cloud backups or our streaming libraries, but from whatever we bothered to carve. Maybe they find a time capsule. A school buried it in 2025 with things that represent our lives. A USB stick, a smartphone, a printed photo, a letter. The USB is useless. The phone is a brick. The photo is faded. But the letter, paper, ink, language, that's what survives. Just like the Sumerians weren't remembered for all the conversations they didn't write down, we won't be remembered for most of the content we produce. The memes, the live streams, the comment section's gone, unless someone prints them or carves them. We think we live in an age of permanent memory. We're actually living in the most fragile memory system humanity has ever built. Now, add climate to that picture. Right now, our sea levels are rising at a rate that seems slow year to year, but brutal century to century. Scientists talk in centimeters. History remembers in drowned cities. We're watching tidal flooding in places that never had it. Storm surges pushing further inland. Island nations negotiating over the fate of their own existence. And we're arguing, is it bad enough? Is it urgent enough? Is it really our fault? You can almost hear some future storyteller shaking their head at our transcripts. Because they won't see the Twitter debates, they'll see the before and after shorelines. To them, it'll look like this. The ice shrank, the seas rose, the coasts flooded, the population moved, the old cities died. New ones appeared, further inland, on higher ground. Sound familiar? Persian Gulf Basin fills, people move north. Black Sea floods, people climb to higher ridges. Southern Mesopotamia drowns, people rebuild along safer stretches. Our unique crisis is an old pattern replaying with different tools. But here's the twist. We're the first civilization to know in advance that it's happening. The Sumerians saw the water. We see the graphs. They reacted to a flood. We're reacting to a forecast. And that makes our excuses weaker and our responsibility heavier. Now imagine how our story gets simplified in the future. We have entire libraries explaining greenhouse gases, industrialization, policy failures, economic incentives. All of that will compress in memory. Just like Meltwater Pulse 1b became the Great Flood, complex global climate feedback loops will become something like they burned too much, the air changed, the water rose. Will there be a single hero story, a future version of Atrahasis or Noah or Zusudra? Maybe some community on a hillside survives a particularly bad generation of storms because someone there paid attention earlier, built away from the water, stored real seeds, kept some books safe, taught their kids why the lowlands are full of ruins. Later, that gets told as one family listened, one group moved in time, they rebuilt. The details will warp, names will change. Algorithms and oil companies might get folded into a single villain called the Devourer, or the Machine, or the Age of Smoke. Our hyper-complex, multi-causal, carefully modelled crisis, it'll be retold as a story with 3 beats: hubris, flood, rebuilding, which, ironically, is how we tell their story now. So where do we fit in that pattern? We're in a weird position. We are both the people causing the next layer of catastrophe, and the only ones who can also leave a manual inside it. The Sumerians left us king lists, temple plans, law codes, star charts, all preserved in clay and stone. What are we leaving that doesn't need electricity? Right now, it's mostly concrete, plastic, radioactive waste in engineered tombs. Maybe a few monuments and archives that somebody printed and bound. We are unbelievably good at leaving behind trash. We are much less deliberate about leaving behind instruction. What if that changed? What if, along with building seawalls and pushing policy and trying to avoid the worst-case scenarios, we also thought like long-term scribes? What would you want written in stone for whoever digs through our layer? Not as a vanity quote or a motivational slogan, as a warning, as a summary, as a gift. Things like, when the coastline moves, Don't insist it stay where it was. Move with it. Don't depend on one kind of energy. Preserve seeds, tools, and knowledge in more than one place. If you ever start thinking your system can't fail, you're already in danger. Imagine a future temple foundation dug up thousands of years from now. The archaeologists clear away the silt, the algae, the crushed rebar, and find a stone slab with some still readable text carved on it. Not the name of a corporation, not a political slogan, not opened by the mayor on this date, but something like, "We knew the waters were rising, we argued, we delayed, we acted too late. Learn from us. Don't wait for the flood to touch your door. It's braces." Would that change the world by itself? No, but it would mean we thought the way the Sumerian scribes thought. We are not the last. Someone is coming after us. We owe them more than ruins. And maybe that's the deepest thread tying all of this together. The Sumerians lived with a constant sense that they were in between. Not the first, not the last. Just one generation of caretakers in a much longer story. Their king said, "I restored what was before." Their scribes said, "I copied what I could not understand so it wouldn't be lost." Their builders said, "I followed the old foundation." Their myths said, "There was a world before ours. It ended in water. We survived by remembering. We like to think we're beyond that. Smarter, safer, permanent. But our position is exactly the same. We are inheritors, not founders. We are adding one layer of clay on top of many, and the water is rising again. So the real question isn't just, were there kings before kings? Were there floods before the flood? Were there civilizations before civilization? The question is, what will we look like in someone else's king list? The ones who didn't listen? The ones who burned everything? Or the ones who finally realized they were caretakers, not owners, and started acting like it? Because somewhere, in a museum we'll never see, a future curator might be holding a fragment from our age, turning it under the light, trying to read what we chose to preserve. And maybe, just maybe, they'll whisper the same thing we whisper over Sumerian clay. They knew more than we thought. They saw what was coming. They tried to remember. If you're still here, you already feel the weight of that. You're standing in the middle of the story, not at the end, and there's still time in our layer of history to decide what we leave behind. Maybe that's the real secret those old clay tablets have been trying to put into words for 4,000 years. History is not something that happens to us. It's something we leave behind. Leonard Woolley thought he'd found the flood. Samuel Noah Kramer thought he'd found the first civilization. We thought the Sumerian King List was the beginning. But every time someone dug deeper, translated further, compared one fragment to another, the beginning shifted backward. Beneath Woolley's flood layer, older walls, older pottery, older graves. Beneath Eridu's visible temple, 16, 17, 18 earlier versions. Behind the first laws and first myths, references to earlier laws, earlier stories, earlier rulers. Every first turned out to be someone else's after. And that should mess with us a little, because we're used to thinking of ourselves as the main characters in human history, the most advanced, the most connected, the most powerful. But from the perspective of time, we're just another layer, another set of foundations, another attempt at organizing chaos before the water, or fire, or famine, or something we didn't model properly comes along and redraws the board. The Sumerians didn't put themselves at the start of the story. They put themselves firmly in the middle. They said kingship was lowered from heaven. We're not the first. We just hold the office now. I rebuilt it as it was in ancient days. We're not innovators. We're restorers, according to the old writings. We don't own this knowledge. We're borrowing it. That mindset changes how you behave. If you believe you invented everything, then you feel entitled to break it, burn it, push it to the limit. If you created it, you can destroy it. If you believe you inherited everything, the mood is different. You're cautious, you're reverent, you're aware that your understanding is incomplete. You don't tear up the irrigation canals on a whim. You don't rewrite the law because you're bored. You don't ignore the river, the climate, the sky, because you know those are the systems that outlast empires. We're in this strange in-between state where we tell ourselves both stories at once. On one hand, we built this tech, we own it, we can do whatever we want. On the other, we've inherited a planet, a climate, a web of life we barely understand. Those two stories are colliding right now. Every time we decide convenience is worth a little more warming, a little more extraction, a little more plastic, we're acting like founders. Every time we talk about future generations, or our kids, or what kind of world we're leaving behind, we're accidentally admitting we're heirs. And heirs have responsibilities, not just to survive, to remember what worked, what broke, where the line is between clever and suicidal. You can almost imagine some Sumerian scribe sitting by lamplight, copying a tablet line by line, knowing he doesn't fully understand all of it, but doing it anyway, because someone told him, don't let this disappear. Even if it doesn't make sense to you yet, someone later might need it. Now, swap the reed stylus for a keyboard. Slide the clay tablet into a hard drive. Replace the oil lamp with blue light. Different tools. Same job. We just don't feel like scribes. We feel like users. Swiping, scrolling, posting, forgetting. The Sumerians didn't know their tablets would end up behind glass in modern museums. They didn't know a guy in 1849 would dig up their king lists and freak out over reigns of 43,200 years. They didn't know their flood myths would be compared to Genesis or Manu or Deucalion. They just knew this. Things end. Floods come. Kings die. Cities fall. But if we write carefully enough, something can cross that gap in fangs. So here's the uncomfortable mirror they're holding up for us. What are we actually writing carefully? What are we making that could cross a gap of 1,000 years? 2,000? 5,000? Is it another subscription service? Or is it a record of what we knew, a warning about what we did wrong, a map of what's fragile and what's worth saving? When you zoom out far enough, the whole Sumerian Anunnaki flood kingship story becomes less about aliens or secret civilizations or lost tech, and more about something almost embarrassingly simple. Humans are very bad at imagining themselves as temporary, but the ones who do leave better ruins. Ruins with instructions. Ruins with context. Ruins that say, we knew this could break, so here's what we tried, here's what failed, here's what we learned, is now horses. We tend to leave ruins that say, mole opening 1998. So if the Sumerians could talk to us, not as mystical ancients, not as first civilization, but just as people who lived through their own version of everything is changing faster than we understand, what would they say? Probably something like, you're not the first to think you're the last. You're not the first to face rising waters. You're not the first to inherit more than you can explain. We didn't preserve everything. We lost more than we saved. But what we did save changed how you see your own story. You have better tools than we ever did. Use them the way we used clay. Not just for trade, not just for power, not just for noise, but for memory. So here's where I'll leave you tonight. The Sumerians looked back and said, we're not the beginning. The future will look back at us and say exactly the same thing. We are not the beginning. We are not the end. We're a layer. And whether that layer looks like a warning, a lesson, or just a smear of plastic and rust, that's still up to us. If you've watched all the way to this point, first of all, respect. Second, I'd love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, do you feel more like a founder or an heir? And if you are an heir, what's one thing you think our generation absolutely has to pass on in a form that can actually survive? Because somewhere, thousands of years from now, someone's going to be brushing dust off whatever we leave behind. And I'd like to think they'll find more than just our trash. If you want to keep going down rabbit holes like this, floods beneath floods, kings before kings, civilizations that saw themselves as custodians rather than creators, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of your little patch of the story. You don't own it, you're just holding it for whoever comes next.